I never imagined that my love for paranormal investigations would lead me to a village so quiet, so perfect. At first, it seemed like the kind of place people would write postcards about. Stone cottages with ivy-clad walls, little flower boxes hanging from windowsill, and cobbled streets that curved lazily between narrow lanes. It was picturesque, and that's exactly what made me suspicious. Nothing was ever this perfect. My boyfriend, Adam, didn't share my wariness. He was already lost in the charm of the place, chatting with the locals like he was in a familiar neighborhood. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was being held back, something dark and unspoken hiding behind every friendly smile. The family that took us in, the Thompsons, were particularly helpful. A little too helpful, actually. Their kindness wasn't warm, it was thick, like honey that stuck to your skin and made it hard to breathe. They were eager to give us everything we could possibly need, always offering more than we could take. It was the kind of hospitality that made you want to ask why they were being so generous. The first night in the house, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing noises, low, unsettling sounds that echoed through the walls. It was just a creaking of old wood, I tried to convince myself, but the longer I listened, the more it felt like something was lurking just beyond the threshold of the room. Sometimes it was the floorboards shifting, other times it was the wind outside, but I could never quite shake the thought that something was waiting. Adam didn't hear it. Or, if he did, he pretended not to. He was snoring lightly beside me, oblivious to the oddity of it all, his back to the window. I wanted to wake him, but I couldn't bring myself to. He'd call me paranoid again, or worse, just brush it off as another one of my wild theories. I looked out the window into the yard. At first, there was nothing, just the patchy grass under the fading moonlight. Then I saw it, a shape, small and shifting, moving across the yard in a jerky, almost unnatural way. A little girl. I squinted. Her form was odd, contorting beneath the silver light. She seemed to be playing with something. Her movements erratic, strange. It wasn't that she looked out of place, it was that she didn't belong. Her head was too large, almost comically so. It was as if her body couldn't support it. But what unnerved me most was the way her shadow stretched on the ground behind her. It was wrong. It didn't match the shape of her, or the way she moved. And then there was a sound, a snort. It wasn't the kind of snort you'd expect from a child, but the low, wet grunt of something far larger, far more animalistic. The girl froze. Her head turned slowly, tilting toward the house. And for just a moment, I thought she saw me. The moonlight caught her face, and I swear, her eyes glistened like something else, something too knowing for a child's gaze. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding, my mind racing for a rational explanation. But I couldn't find one. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks, shadows distorting. But then there was another snort, louder this time. Closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I stumbled back toward the bed, my breath quickening as the weight of the air grew thicker. When I pulled the covers back, that's when I smelled it. At first, it was faint, a lingering odor that could have been mistaken for something else. But then it grew, curling in the sheets, heavy and rancid, like something rotting beneath the bed. I sat up fast, panic rising in my chest, my breath shallow as I looked down. I couldn't breathe. I reached for Adam, hoping to wake him, hoping he'd tell me it was just a nightmare. But I froze mid-reach. What I saw under the blanket wasn't him. It was a pig, a filthy, bloated thing. Its body was massive, its skin slick and matted, the stench overwhelming. Its eyes were wide, dull, and glassy, staring at me with an emptiness that went deeper than any animal's gaze. It was his body. I knew that. But this was no man, this was something far more grotesque. Its hooves twitched beneath the blanket, and for a long, unbearable moment, we simply stared at each other, unblinking. And then, I snapped out of it. I scrambled back, heart pounding like a drum in my ears, pushing myself into the corner of the bed. The pig's body shifted under the blanket, and I could hear the disgusting sound of its snorts, as though it was drawing a breath deep into its chest, like it wanted to inhale my fear. I tore my eyes away from it, trying to look at the room, anything but that. But nothing was real. My breath was ragged now, my pulse quick. I could feel the sweat dampening my clothes, my fingers shaking. I couldn't bring myself to look back. I couldn't, and I yet did. The blanket was empty. There was no pig, but there was also no Adam. The bed was cold where he had been, and I was left alone in the dark, the silence pressing in around me like a thick fog. The only sound I could hear was my own frantic heartbeat, hammering in my chest. I blinked, wiped my eyes. Was this real? I rubbed my face, trying to shake the nightmare from my head, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I looked around the room, my eyes catching on the strange shadows, The corners too dark, too still, and then I thought I heard a snort again. The sun crept in through the cracks in the curtains, soft and forgiving, as though it had no idea what had transpired during the night. I lay there in the silence, my breath shallow, trying to convince myself it had all been a dream, a nightmare maybe, one of those vivid heart-stopping ones that you can never quite shake off when you wake. But the dread still clung to me, like a shadow that refused to leave. I looked at the empty spot where Adam had been, and for a moment, it felt as though I were still trapped in that strange, twisted dream. Maybe he had left me alone. He would have done that. Maybe he thought I was just being dramatic again, chasing ghosts where there were none. I sat up slowly, wiping the cold sweat from my forehead, and called his name, soft at first, then louder. No response. I stumbled out of bed, my legs shaking beneath me. The house was unnervingly still, the air thick with something I couldn't name. The usual morning sounds, the creaking of the floorboards, the soft hum of birds outside, were missing. There was only silence. I stepped out into the hallway, and it was like the house itself was holding its breath. Every step felt too loud, like it reverberated through the walls. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me, pushing me, suffocating me. The Thompsons' door was ajar, just slightly, and I could hear the faintest murmurs coming from inside. They didn't sound quite right, though. Not the easy conversations I'd heard before, but something else, something sharp. The floorboards creaked beneath me as I approached the kitchen, the smell of bacon wafting toward me, oddly familiar and wrong all at once. I hesitated, taking a breath before pushing the door open. Inside, the family was sitting at the table, just like before, just like nothing had happened. They were smiling, laughing even, the same easy warmth in their eyes. It was too normal, but there was something off. The table had been set for breakfast, with steaming plates of eggs and bacon, golden brown toast and jam. But as I scanned the room, my stomach churned. There was an odd heaviness in the air, a thickness to the light, and I felt as though I was walking underwater, every movement slow and weighted. I searched for Adam's face. He wasn't there. "Good morning." Mrs. Thompson called out, her voice cheerful, too cheerful. She waved her hand toward the empty seat across from her. "Join us, dear. You must be starving after all that adventure yesterday." I couldn't find my voice, couldn't bring myself to speak. My body felt as though it had betrayed me, frozen in place. I just nodded, too unnerved to do anything else. As I sat down at the table, the first thing I noticed was the date on my watch. I didn't know why I had checked it, but something tugged at the back of my mind. Something told me I needed to know. Yesterday's date. My hand trembled as I glanced at the clock on the wall, the minute hand stuck, like time itself was frozen in place. My stomach twisted painfully, and my mind started to spiral. Something was wrong. I looked around the room again, desperately trying to find an anchor, some kind of normality to pull me back. The Thompsons were still talking, still laughing. They looked at me as though waiting for me to catch up, to join in, but there was a subtle shift in their eyes now. I couldn't quite place it, but it was there. Just a fraction of a second, too quick to notice, too quick to ignore. And then, the smell hit me again. It was worse this time, sharper, more suffocating. It wasn't just the bacon. The air tasted like it had been soaked in something rotten, something decayed. I couldn't breathe. My lungs burned, my chest tight, and it felt as though I were sinking into the floor. My vision blurred, everything spinning around me like I was trapped in some horrible dream. The room began to pulse, the sounds of the Thompsons' louder warping, blending into something deep, something guttural snorting. I grabbed my spoon, my hand shaking violently. I looked into it, desperate for anything to ground me. That's when I saw her. The little girl, she was sitting at the table now, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Her hair was disheveled, but it was her face that made my blood run cold. Her skin was pale, sickly, the hollowed-out shape of a child's face twisted into something grotesque. It wasn't just the size of her head anymore, it was the form. Her skin was stretched thin over the bones, too thin. The shadows of her face seemed to leak into her features, warping them. But what made my heart stop, what made my body freeze, was her smile. It wasn't a child's smile, it was too knowing, too predatory. As if she had been waiting for me to see it. The grin stretched too wide for her face, almost unnatural, and as she tilted her head, I noticed it. Half of her face had shifted, no longer human, but something else. A pig. The other half was still human, twisted in its own horror, but that one side was unmistakably pig-like. Her eyes, no, her eye, glistened with something wrong, reflecting back a grotesque animal hunger. Her lips parted, her mouth stretching too far, and she leaned toward me with uncanny calmness. "Is everything all right?" she asked, Her voice was sweet, too sweet, but there was a harshness behind it that made my skin crawl. I couldn't answer. I couldn't move. The world felt like it was closing in around me. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in, the air turning suffocating. I couldn't pull my eyes away from her, couldn't look away even though every instinct in me screamed to run. And then, no one else seemed to notice. The Thompsons kept talking, their words blending into a hum of white noise, their smiles wide and unbroken. Adam, my Adam, was still missing from the seat beside me. But there, across from me, that little girl with the pig's face, the unblinking gaze, was waiting, smiling. And then, her eyes flickered toward the others, then back to me. Her smile widened. Everything, all right. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. And then, just as quickly, I felt the floor shift beneath me. I couldn't tell if I was going to pass out or if I was already slipping into another world altogether. The room was spinning, and as my vision darkened, the last thing I saw was that grotesque, twisted face, half child, half pig. And then everything went black. I woke with a jolt, my body shooting upright in bed, my heart pounding as though it were trying to break free from my chest. The room was still dark, the curtains drawn, the only sound the erratic thump of my heartbeat. I blinked a few times, disoriented, the edges of the dream. No, it wasn't a dream, still clinging to me like a second skin. I stared at the walls, the ceiling, my breath ragged as if I had run miles. I forced myself to breathe, to calm down, but the fear still surged in waves. It felt real, too real, but everything was normal. Adam was beside me, sleeping soundly, his steady breathing rising and falling. He was there. He hadn't been replaced. He hadn't turned into a pig. But even so, the chill in my bones didn't go away. That feeling like something was off, something was horribly wrong, refused to loosen its grip on me. The room was too quiet, too still. I turned to Adam, reached out to touch his shoulder, but I stopped. It wasn't the right time. I didn't want to wake him, not yet. I needed a moment, just a moment, to make sense of everything. Maybe I was still caught in the tail end of that nightmare. Maybe it wasn't real. Maybe I was still dreaming. But then, I heard the sound again, a faint snort. It was so soft at first that I thought it was my imagination, a leftover fragment of the nightmare teasing me. But then it came again, louder, closer. I sat up abruptly, looking around the room, heart pounding again. Adam didn't stir. The house was still, but there was something behind that stillness. Something moving. I couldn't place it, but the snorting was unmistakable. It was the sound of a pig, low and guttural, too close for comfort. I bolted upright, my hand slamming down onto the bedside table, knocking my phone onto the floor. The snort came again, louder. It felt like it was right there, just behind me. I turned, my pulse racing as I scanned the room. Nothing. The shadows in the corners were just shadows. The air felt thick, almost too heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I dared not look under the bed. That was the place in my nightmares, the place where the wrongness hid, where the pig-headed child had crawled from. But I had to know. I fell to my knees beside the bed, eyes scanning the floor. I reached under slowly, my fingers trembling as I touched the cool wood, pushing aside the dust and debris. I flinched as something wet brushed my fingers. A puddle of something thick and dark. It smelled like blood. I yanked my hand back, my body shaking as I scrambled away, pushing myself into the corner of the room. I could feel my chest tightening again, the familiar panic clawing its way back up my throat. I could still hear the snorting, faint but there. My head spun with dizziness, the world tilting at a sickening angle. I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind or if something far darker was at play here. Was it a hallucination? Was I dreaming? But the scent, God, that horrible, pungent stench, clung to the air, relentless. It was no dream. And then, through the haze of fear and confusion, I heard a voice, soft, almost gentle. Is everything all right? I froze it, Adam's voice. It wasn't anyone's voice I recognized. I knew that voice, the child's voice, the pig child's voice. I turned toward the door, my body trembling violently, my gaze falling on the figure standing there in the hallway. It was her again, the little girl with the grotesque malformed face. But now her features were sharper, more pronounced. The transformation wasn't subtle anymore. It was like she had been waiting for me, watching me from the corner of the room as I tried to make sense of this madness. Her head was still too big, but now it was more than that. It was wrong on a level I couldn't describe. Her eyes were dark, sunken into the mass of her face, her skin slick and grazy, reflecting a sickly light. Her mouth, the smile, that horrible smile, was wider now, distorted in a way that made my stomach twist. And she was standing there, looking at me, waiting. But what chilled me more than anything was the fact that she was alone. No one else in the house seemed to notice. No one reacted. I couldn't breathe. Is everything all right? She asked again, her voice almost sing-song. Too innocent to be real. I couldn't answer. I couldn't find my voice. But I could hear it then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps from the hallway. They weren't normal footsteps, though. They were heavy, wet, like something else was walking through the house. A slow, deliberate pace that seemed to draw closer with every passing second. And then out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, Adam. But it wasn't Adam. His face was twisted, too, pulled tight into something grotesque, something inhuman. His eyes were wide and empty, hollow, with a dull, glassy sheen. His mouth hung open, but the snort came from him this time. It was like his very being was suffused with it. The transformation was happening. The man I had once known was gone. I wanted to scream, but the sound of my voice was strangled, caught somewhere deep inside my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The pig-headed child smiled again, and in that moment, it was clear. This wasn't a dream, this wasn't a nightmare. This was my new reality. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My whole body felt paralyzed, as though every cell in me had decided to betray me in the most horrifying way. The room was spinning, my vision blurring at the edges, and all I could hear was the sound of those sickening snorts. Too close, too real, like a thunderous echo of a nightmare I had yet to wake from. The little pig child was standing still now, staring at me, her head slightly cocked like she was studying me, fascinated. But those eyes, the emptiness behind them, there was nothing innocent about her anymore. Her grin stretched impossibly wide. The corners of her mouth tugged to grotesque proportions. And still she just asked, that sickly sweet voice cutting through the suffocating air, "Is everything all right?" No. No, nothing was all right. Everything was falling apart. My world had shattered. Reality was breaking apart at the seams, and I couldn't stitch it back together. The grotesque sounds from behind me grew louder, closer. I didn't dare turn around, but I could feel in Adam, standing there now, his presence. No, it wasn't him anymore. Not really. He was one of them now. He was part of whatever this was, whatever this nightmare had become. His body shifted unnaturally, his movements jerky, like he was struggling against something inside him, trying to keep hold of his humanity. But I could see the truth now, the pig-headed truth. His face had twisted into something monstrous, too, just like the villagers, just like everyone. His eyes locked with mine, hollow and devoid of recognition. "Are you all right?" he asked, but his voice was distorted, muddled, guttural, like something trapped inside a carcass. The moment his eyes met mine, I knew. He wasn't just changed, he had been changed from the start. This wasn't his first transformation. This wasn't my Adam. My Adam had never been here at all. Not really. The man in front of me was an imposter, a grotesque mockery of the person I had once loved. The reality around me, the house, the hallway, began to waver. The world felt like it was on the edge of a precipice, teetering between dimensions I couldn't understand. Was this really happening? Was I trapped in a sick joke? A cruel game that couldn't be escaped? I felt a presence behind me, cold and malicious. The room, once my refuge, had turned into a twisted carnival of horrors. Shadows seemed to gather at the edges of the walls, but not shadows of light. No, these shadows had mass. They moved. They were just waiting. They were feeding, growing, and the darkness in them was stretching out, ready to consume me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My lungs were filled with that suffocating air, heavy with the smell of rot. I stared into Adam's soulless eyes one last time, and then as if on cue, I felt something shift, something break. My mind, my very sense of self, snapped. The pig-headed child stepped forward, her smile widening as she reached out, her fingers long and spindly, the tips twitching. Her nails were sharp, jagged like they had been filed into claws. She touched my arm, and the shock that ran through me was unlike anything I'd ever felt, cold, burning, searing. I let out a scream, but it wasn't my voice anymore. It was the voice of something else, something deeper, something darker. The world cracked in an instant, the walls of the house folding inward. And then, I was outside. I gasped for air, feeling the weight of everything crash down on me. The sky above me, so bright, so beautiful, didn't feel right. The colors were all wrong, washed out, as if painted by someone who didn't understand the hues of reality. The trees, the road, the very earth beneath my feet, all of it seemed warped, out of place. But then I saw them. The villagers, the same grotesque creatures I had seen in the house, were standing in a perfect line before me, their heads swaying, twitching in unison. They were watching me, their snouts flaring as they snorted and sniffed the air, a procession of monstrosities, each one more horrifying than the last. And in the center of the line stood him, Adam. His face, his pig face, was no longer just a mask. It was his reality. He was a part of them now, fully and completely. His eyes locked onto mine, empty and hollow, and for a brief moment, just a second, there was a flicker of recognition. But it was fleeting. Gone in an instant, swallowed by the darkness in his eyes. I felt something stir inside me, a realization that was as horrifying as it was undeniable. I was never meant to escape. This was my fate. The village, the people, they had been waiting for me. I had walked into their trap, a knave fool stumbling into the web, never realizing that I was never meant to leave. My world had already been replaced. The life I had known, everything, had been consumed, transformed, twisted into something unrecognizable. The snorting grew louder, the villagers moving closer. They surrounded me, their grotesque faces leering, their mouths opening, but it wasn't to speak, it was to feed. I stumbled back, my legs buckling beneath me, and just as I felt the world closing in, the sky darkening with the weight of inevitability, I heard one final whisper. A voice soft, sweet voice that had come from everywhere. Is everything all right? I couldn't answer. Then everything went black and I woke up. I gasped for air, clutching at my chest as though I were drowning. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart slamming against my rib cage. I was in my bed. It was only a dream, just a dream. I turned toward Adam, relieved to see him lying there, normal, his face peaceful, unmarked by any grotesque transformation. I reached out to touch him, to feel his warmth, to ground myself in something real. He stirred in his sleep, mumbling, but then for a brief second I noticed something strange. In the reflection of the dark window, I saw him, my boyfriend, but something was wrong. His face had shifted. I saw the pit, half-formed, in the reflection behind me, his hollow eyes staring directly at me, his lips curling into an unsettling smile. I turned, my breath freezing in my chest. Adam was still there, his face normal, unaware. But the one in the reflection, the other Adam, was grinning at me, eyes dark, empty. He gave a slight nod, as though acknowledging me, as if he knew I was aware. And then, with a quiet, almost imperceptible movement, he turned and walked away. The room was silent, but the smile, that smile was the last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed everything. And it was then I realized I was never meant to leave.